Good morning, boys and girls. Welcome back to our study of Job. Last week we talked about his friends and how his friends had come to encourage him. But that's right, Peter. We're going to jump into this week, and we did mention it last week, but I didn't kind of park on that. Job's friends had said that Job had done wrong, and God was punishing Job for what he had done. And it kind of bounces back and forth. Chapter 8, his friend Bildad speaks. Chapters 9 and 10, Job answers. Chapter 11, Zophar speaks. Chapters 12 through 14, Job answers. Chapter 15, Eliphaz speaks. 16, 17, Job answers. 18, Bildad speaks. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through the whole book. Chapter 19, Job answers, and so on and so forth. It kind of just goes back and forth. So we're not really going to spend a ton of time listening in on their conversation. Job's friends tried to convince Job that he had sinned and gone against God, and that's why this evil had come. So they're just they're trying to point this out. Job, this is why. You've done wrong. Why don't you just repent? And Job keeps answering them, but I didn't. I didn't do evil. Now, he's not saying he's perfect, but we studied back in Job chapter 1 that he was upright. So he had done what was right. He was a righteous man. In Job chapter 32, verse 1, it says, so these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. So Job had done what was right. Now, I kind of did, as I was reading that, was like, wait, righteous in his own eyes. But boys and girls, basically, they couldn't find anything to say, this is what you did wrong, and this is why you're being punished. They couldn't come up with something specific. Boys and girls, do you remember why this trouble came? I mean, it's been a couple weeks and we didn't really repeat it. But if you remember, there was a conversation in heaven between Satan and God, and how God was so pleased with Job. And Satan had said, well, that's because he's so blessed. And God had said that Satan could take away what Job had. And then we talked about another conversation in heaven, and that it was because he couldn't touch him physically. You're right, Peter. And then he got the boils all over the place. So boys and girls, it wasn't because Job had sinned. It wasn't a punishment for what he had done. But Job's friends were blaming him for his troubles, even though they weren't. Well, then a fourth friend comes on the scene, and he isn't any more help to Job. So now Job has four friends who are basically being pretty discouraging. Again, we're not reading through a ton of this, boys and girls. We just jumped from like chapter 5 to chapter 32. And we see where these friends just aren't being good friends. Boys and girls, when we first looked at these friends, they were good friends. They had traveled from afar to come be with Job. They were spending time with Job, just being understanding that Job was going through a hard time and just sitting there and being there. Sometimes it's helpful when we have friends who are just there. They don't have to say the right words. They don't have to crack a funny joke. They don't have to bring a present, but they're just there. Well, boys and girls, sometimes we have friends who are good and encouraging, and sometimes we have friends who are discouraging, friends who aren't good for us. And we see that Job's friends kind of turned out that way. They weren't good for Job. They were discouraging him. They weren't encouraging him in what was right. They kept discouraging. And honestly, they weren't trusting Job. They kept coming back to, no, it's you. It's your fault. Well, boys and girls, what kind of friend are you going to be this week? Or even today, in the next hour? At first, Job's friends seemed like good friends. They traveled to come and see Job, and 7 days and 7 nights is a long time to just sit there. But then they blamed Job. They didn't believe he was innocent. Boys and girls, will you be the kind of friend who encourages your friends? You point your friends back to Christ? You point them to the goodness of God? Or are you going to sit there and go, no, you're wrong. No, you're bad. Now, sometimes when we're doing wrong, we do need a friend to point out we're doing wrong. But in this case, Job hadn't done wrong. As you go throughout this week, boys and girls, I hope that you'll be the kind of friend who encourages your friends. Well, boys and girls, in chapter 38, I have a heading in my Bible, and can you see there, Peter, who is talking now? Yeah, God speaks. All this time, God hasn't said anything to Job. In chapter 38, God is going to speak to Job. And boys and girls, you're going to have to come back next week to find out what it is that God tells Job. Make sure this week you're a good friend